QSO Today, episode 503, Todd McKenney, KN4TPG. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank again Larry Classy, W4LEC, Greg Lane, N4KGL, and Adrian Lambert, M5ADL, who are continuing monthly sponsors of the QSO Today podcast. Their support continues to keep QSO Today going after 500 episodes. Please become a listener sponsor today. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on the links to take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog also contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Todd McKenney, KN4TPG, found his way into amateur radio through a teenager's deep dive into YouTube and discovering meteorological balloon launches, leading to Bill Brown, WB8ELK, and Pico ballooning. Todd's entry into ham radio may be the key to attracting young people into amateur radio by using our hobby as a tool to complement and extend the usability of their other STEM or maker projects and hobbies. KN4TPG tells his ham radio story through his high school ballooning interest, leading to graduate work at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, in this QSO Today. KN4TPG, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Todd?
I'm here.
Todd, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Oh, that's a great question. So I believe I actually got into ham radio when I was in high school. I actually started ham radio because I actually got into ballooning first. So if anyone knows about ballooning, you send up these. I started with latex balloons, so it's these kind of the classic balloons that meteorologists launch at these sounding stations all over the world. And basically, my first experiment with a balloon was launching a cigar box with an old iPhone camera on a latex balloon with a little GPS tracker to see where it went and to go out and recover it. So my love of ham radio actually came from, I was doing these balloon launches, but without an amateur radio license, I couldn't kind of do some like live downlink tracking, right? I was just getting these cheap cell GPS trackers. So I ended up wanting to get my tech license to actually get into APRS, which is a really great way to track different things, either balloons, cars, people. There's some satellite stuff going on now. So I actually got into ham radio through ballooning. I know that's kind of an interesting route to take. Usually people kind of start off with ham radio. But for me, it actually began because I wanted to use ham radio as a tool to, do more balloon launches.
Let's go back a little bit. The hometown is?
So I grew up in Fort Mill, South Carolina, which is, just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I think my first balloon launch, my parents got a cabin up in Boone, North Carolina. So that's where I did my first balloon launch, was actually from the mountains.
Where did the interest in ballooning come from?
I always think about that. I think I was just, on YouTube one day, and, you go on YouTube and there's these, all these people just put these videos out. And I think I saw somebody do just a balloon launch. They just put a camera on a balloon, they launched it, and, I was kind of amazed that anybody could just do a project like this. Because when you think of ballooning, it's kind of interesting. I think the first thing I heard about it, they called it the poor man's rocketry program. Because you send up, these amateur radio rockets, or excuse me, these amateur rockets, just the classic rocket hobby, they actually don't go that high. Whereas these latex balloons, I mean, you can get to the stratosphere. I mean, it's crazy. You can literally see the curve if you have a video camera on your payload. And that was something that I was really interested in, is like, that's a project I could do as a student. I could get that close to space, I guess you could say, by just doing a balloon launch.
Well, you did have the guy with the beach chair and the party balloons, right? That was a poor man's space program.
Oh, yeah.
He was going to use a BB gun to bring himself back down.
So funny you say that. I remember when all that happened. I think he got arrested. That's unfortunate. That sounds fun.
Because he probably scrambled the Air Force.
Yeah. But so I originally started in latex balloons. I got my tech. And then, a few years passed. I was doing all these latex balloons. And then I ended up going to University of Alabama in Huntsville for college. And that's when I actually met Bill Brown, which probably a lot of people know. He's kind of the father of, ham radio ballooning. And he actually lives very close to Huntsville. He works, on the Arsenal here over here in Huntsville. So I met him I was actually there's this really cool website called Sondhub Amateur, which is basically a website which people can post their balloon flights, right? So you can track your balloon flights on these maps and see what other people are doing around the world with amateur radio balloons.
What does Sondhub refer to?
So it's basically, it's a hub. When you say Sondhub, Radio Sond, right? I think that's where the name comes from.
Radio Sonds.
Yeah, that site was originally for just the National Weather Service or these weather organizations who all fly these normal latex balloons, every 12 hours all around the globe for weather forecasts, right? You send up the balloon, you get the data, and then you take that data and you plug it into a weather model, and it helps, forecast our weather. They're very important for, meteorological studies. But Sondhub Amateur is more for people who are just amateurs, right? Doing their own launches, building their own payloads, sending up their own radios on balloons. So that kind of caters to that side. And then you have Sondhub, with just the classic Sondhub, which is just for like radio science, right?
So you're a teenager that discovers ballooning on YouTube.
Yes.
You go in deep on YouTube. Where did you find the source of latex balloons? And what kind of budget did you have in order to be able to start building balloons? In terms of the payloads, what payloads did you use before you had a license?
Yeah, so before I was a ham, when I was doing these payloads, it was literally me just scrounging up together, stuff I could find around the house. The first thing I launched was an old iPhone, to be the camera, because it seems like we're all getting new iPhones a day. So, you have your old iPhone. So, and then like I said, I put it in a wooden box. And these latex balloons, you just go online and you can buy them. I mean, if you really think about it, party balloons, it's latex, right? All a latex balloon is, latex weather balloon is a larger party balloon, right? It's thicker. It's designed to go higher. It's designed to carry more mass, right? As far as the helium, you've probably seen this in Walmart. My first balloon launch was these little, I used helium from those little party tanks.
So you bought a party tank, or you rented a party tank?
It's called Party Time Helium. And I actually saw it in Walmart a little bit ago.
Like in a spray can?
Yeah, it's just this little can. It looks like a red tank. So that's kind of where, and I actually there's not a lot of helium in them. I actually had to buy 3 of them to actually fill up my balloon. So it was 3 of these tanks to get my first balloon launch off the ground. So,
as a teenager, how are you funding this project?
Parents helped out a little bit, obviously. But again, a lot of the stuff that I flew was just stuff that was already around the house. It's, your old iPhone camera, your cigar box, that I kind of cut and painted, and, just string lying around the house, kind of made a mock parachute with a sheet. And again, all this stuff, it's really great. You can go on Google, you can Google things, and, there's all these kind of do-it-yourself projects that are out there that people have kind of shared. And it's just pulling from those different sources, right, to do your own project.
So the trial and error is not as painful as it could have been because of all the people that went before that are sharing on YouTube.
Exactly. And that's what's great about the internet now these days. If you want to learn a new skill, there are so many resources out there. It's both a blessing and a curse because there's so much. It's like, what do you pick and what do you do? But it's a blessing because you have so many avenues to go down. And so, like you said, it's a rabbit hole, right? So endless information.
Right, good and bad. When you were looking and exploring amateur ballooning, and before you met Bill Brown, did you find some information that perhaps was spurious or maybe not helpful?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to a lot of amateur radio hobbies, you can go to these websites that have chats and people talking about what they think is better. And then, you always stumble upon two people arguing about, no, do it this way because this way sucks. And, but it's like that for all amateur hobbies, right? I mean, people always have their own way of doing things. And I think that's what makes hobbies so fun, right? It's just you get to kind of explore it yourself and find out what works for you rather than a hard set way, right? I think that kind of sets, this amateur space away from more professional stuff because they have a way of doing things.
Now, did this interest in ballooning, did this lead to maybe the choices that you made for your education and career? I mean, you're speaking to me right now from a laboratory at the University of Huntsville.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I mean, right now I actually just got my master's in atmospheric science. So I like to say I'm an engineer by heart, but an atmospheric scientist by trade because, I love to build things and I love to kind of make my own payloads and, do these things. What I also love is this idea that you're building something to accomplish a goal, right? And that's what I really loved about the ballooning space because you can send up all these sensors to kind of get data about our atmosphere. I just think that's really cool, right? You're doing science, literally.
And getting paid for it at some point.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course. It's kind of funny you say that, just me launching my cigar box as a kid kind of inspired me to actually go into more of a career path for atmospheric science and to be able to do now. I've done so many different balloon projects that, I wouldn't have thought I would have been able to do. I mean, it's absolutely incredible when I look back on it now, from where I started and where I am right now.
I know that Bill listens to the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think Bill's greatest contribution to your knowledge has been in terms of maybe the direction that you're going or even the approach to ballooning that you've adopted?
Yeah, so I met Bill Brown, like I said. So he builds, the sky trackers. That's what they're called. They fly on Pico balloons. And I didn't even know what Pico ballooning was until I guess the way I discovered it, I kind of went down the rabbit hole. I was on some Sondhub Amateur, and I'm so used to seeing these latex balloons. Before I knew about Pico ballooning, that go up, they burst, and they come back down, right? And that's the end of the flight. It's like a 2-hour flight around. But I was looking at the math. I'm like, oh my gosh, this balloon has been up for a month. What's going on here? How is that happening? How does that work? So I kind of did a, rabbit hole search, and I actually stumbled upon Bill Brown, who builds these little tiny, Pico trackers to fly on these little Pico balloon party balloons. So that's how I ended up reaching out to Bill because I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do this. I want to fly something. I want something to stay up for more than 2 hours. I want it to travel around the world and go to different countries. And that was so fascinating to me at the time. So, I reached out to him, called him up, and he helped me so much do my first Pico balloon flight, which was an APRS Pico balloon launch. So that's kind of how I got into it and learned about Pico ballooning was through Bill and kind of looking around. And after that APRS launch, that actually inspired me to get my general license because I wanted to do the whisper flights, and you need for the 20-meter whisper, you need a general license. So that kind of made me want to keep climbing up the license tree, I guess you could say.
Then the APRS beacons on these balloons is on VHF.
Yes.
So a technician class license will cover it. And it's my understanding there are certain countries that if you fly over them, you're not allowed to. They don't do aviation, mobile, and amateur radio. So your transponder then knows which areas to black out?
Exactly. It's a little geofence. That's, yeah. And I think one of them, there's North Korea, Yemen, and the UK. Those are the big three.
What an interesting combination there.
I know. You wouldn't imagine, but yeah, so those are really smart. And we've seen it, they're coming over North Korea and then they just shut off. It's brilliant.
Okay, so you upgraded to general so that you could operate Whisper on 20 meters.
Yes.
You were on a panel for the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo last year, and we actually did a balloon forum that was around the Chinese balloon.
Yeah.
To understand how balloons were actually being used in amateur radio and how, in fact, there are thousands of balloons that are launched, every day around the world. What are they doing differently with the latex balloons that they pop at the top, whereas the Pico balloons are not popping as they rise in altitude? It obviously is a different goal. The Weather Service wants to go up and down. What are they doing differently that causes their balloons to pop?
Yeah, so latex balloons, right, they're designed to stretch, right? So when you launch a latex balloon from the surface, it's going to rise typically between 5 to 6 meters per second. That's what the National Weather Service aimed for. And that balloon is going to expand, and it's going to keep expanding until it reaches the, quote, burst altitude. And then, it's going to explode, and it's going to fall with a parachute. They put a parachute on, and that just falls to the ground, and, they're done. That's the whole flight. They have their atmospheric profile, and they're good to go. And then they're ready for their next launch, the next 12 hours to do it again for the weather forecasts.
They've got like a vending machine in these airports. It looks like a 20-foot shipping container with an outlet on the top. I've seen YouTubes of these things where these balloons are actually launched automatically.
Yeah. That's they're trying to implement more of those because labor, if you could just automatically launch. Yeah. But it's a hefty price tag to get it set up at the beginning, but they're more common now in these remote sites, for instance, like the higher latitudes. But they still have to come back, and restock, the sondes and the balloons. So it's not 100% automatic. So a lot of stations are like, is it worth it to spend all that money to try to automate it? And a lot of them don't, because if you live in the city 5 minutes away from your job to launch a balloon, then it's kind of, it's a no-brainer.
So a Pico balloon are these small party balloons?
Yes.
With a even smaller, lighter...
Yes. Yeah, and the reason why these Pico balloons don't burst like the latex balloons is because, they start to rise. They're expanding a little bit, but they reach their float altitude, right, where the gas is trying to push out. But these Pico balloons, which are typically made of polyethylene, so it's more of a plastic material, it's going to stop that gas from expanding. So what happens is your balloon is kind of rising, and then it's going to stop. It's going to float because that parcel in that balloon has reached a constant density level, we call it. So the balloon is now free to float it's called a constant density surface. So the latex balloons are great for your normal atmospheric profile over one site, but the Pico balloons are better for mapping like global circulation patterns, right? If you want to release something and see where it goes over long periods of time, right, on a constant density surface, that's a better choice, right? Because, these balloons can stay up for months, sometimes even years, to, map these circulation patterns in terms of weather studies.
You have a desired elevation that you want to travel at. Is there a way to calculate that in terms of how much gas, how much size the Pico balloon has to be in order to be able to get there?
Yes, I actually did a paper on that where you can estimate the float density, it's called, what altitude it's going to float at. And that comes into play of, where you are flying, right? Because if you're trying to float a balloon at, like, let's say a much colder area or like a higher latitude, you're going to find your float altitude is going to be lower just because of the temperature, column that you're trying to float in. There's the mass of your payload, right? If something's too heavy, if it's much heavier, you're going to float lower. The size of your balloon, if your balloon is larger, it can typically float higher, right? But it also is the weight of your balloon. So it's kind of a trade-off, right? If you're trying to make your balloon larger, you're also going to make it heavier. So if it's heavier, it's going to want to float lower. And then, of course, choosing if you want to use helium or hydrogen. It makes a difference. Hydrogen can cause your balloon to float higher because it's lighter than helium. Helium, you'll actually float lower. So there's a lot of different things. You can plug all this stuff into a few equations. You measure your payload, the diameter of your balloon, you know what lifting gas you're using, the temperature you're launching at and what the temperature at float would be. You can do all these things to get a pretty good, accurate estimation of where you're actually going to float. So, yes, you can.
And you have a calculator that you've created online?
I don't have an online calculator, but I did a paper on that that's in the Journal of Atmospheric or Technology. It's an AMS journal, which has all the equations where you can do all this yourself. Do all your calculations to figure out where would I float if I flew.
And is that paper around the world they go, circumventing balloon satellites?
No, it's actually the paper I'm referring to. It's called Methodology of Performance of Pico Balloons in Antarctica. That's the paper. That first paper you mentioned was actually the first paper I did. I used Pico balloons for like a weather study, looking at atmospheric trajectories.
So we'll put that reference in the show notes page. Okay, so what are SAG balloons then?
If you're referring to Mylar, so there's Pico balloons. There's two different types of Pico balloons we typically fly. I just did a quick Google search. I think you are referring to these Mylar balloons. I looked up SAG balloons. It looks like Mylar balloons are coming up. So polyethylene is your classic, more plastic balloon, right? It's kind of, I like to compare it to it almost looks like a Walmart shopping bag. Whereas, a Mylar balloon, it's kind of that foil balloon. If you've gone to a party, you've probably seen they're very, they're kind of shinier. So people use both for Pico ballooning. The Mylar balloons, typically I've seen they float a little lower. They actually can float.
Because they're heavier.
Yes, they're heavier.
Because of the shiny material perhaps on the outside?
Yeah, it's probably due to the material choice. Polyethylene is much lighter, so it can float a little higher. So those are the two differences. A lot of people are moving more towards the polyethylene now because, these Mylar balloons, I actually have a paper in review. When you're floating literally just like 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers higher, your probability that you're going to stay up longer is exponentially higher. Because when you're floating, let's say at 9 kilometers, which is, right at the top of the troposphere, you're more likely to hit a storm or like these big pop-up convection events, these big anvil clouds that like to kind of pierce up. You're likely to hit that if you're floating lower. So they're actually going to go down sooner compared to if you're floating much higher in the lower stratosphere, which you can typically get when you're flying on the lighter polyethylene balloons. So that's kind of the summary of that. I typically always want to try to optimize my flight altitude to float as high as possible because I want to stay up for as long as possible. I want to go around the world as many times as I want, or can.
Right, especially since you have the payloads cost money.
Yes, exactly.
I just bought 2 Whisper transmitters from QRP Labs because I think I wanted to try some ballooning on my own. Well, you know what? That's $60.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You don't want to be cavalier with your $60 payload.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus, I guess you have to add the solar panels and everything else.
Yeah.
Could someone take, say, dry cleaning bags, or could somebody go to a dry cleaning supply and buy a roll of dry cleaning bag material and make your own balloons?
Yeah, so a lot of people have done that and still are trying that. The hardest part about that, kind of talked about this in this paper I already mentioned to you, is ensuring that your balloon has a tight enough seal. And a lot of people, what they do is they use these sealing irons, basically, to try to, build their own balloons, because, if you get a balloon and you build it and it's much, has a much larger volume, you're going to float higher. And what people do is they build these balloons, they seal everything. And what they do is they pressure test it. So to test their balloon before they even fly it, they typically hook up it's called a nanometer, and they fill it up with, compressed gas, right? Typically just air, and they see how much it can take before bursting. And depending on where you're floating, there's a certain basically threshold you need to meet to say, yes, if I launch this and it goes up to that altitude, it can take the force and it can sit there and float. So there's all these things you can do on the ground if you're building your own balloon to test to see if the balloon will successfully float or not. And, that's the best way for building your own balloon, is basically experimenting in the lab and figuring out if you can make it work based off what the math says.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player, link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. So I saw on your website you actually had an article about the Stretchinator, and it looked like it was an activity at someone's lab or someone's living room perhaps, where they built an Arduino-based device to, I guess, measure this pressure before it pops. Is that right?
Yeah, so a lot of people have done that. I wrote a custom software with this. We built this little, you've heard of a teensy microcontroller, just hooked it up to one of these, off the shelf. Basically, you put a little tube on this, the circuit board, and it measures the internal pressure. And I wrote some software, and you can see the graph on the computer, and you can see the pressure in the balloon. So yeah, that's you honestly, if you really want to get into that, building your own balloon, you need something like that, because you need to be able to collect the data, right? I like to say, you're only a scientist if you're writing down what you're doing, right? But what's great, you don't really need to build your own if you're trying to get into this hobby. You can get off the shelf nanometers, and that's what I started with. Was just its little handheld device which has a screen that just tells you the pressure.
You're now an expert I mean, I would say that if you're working on a doctorate in atmospheric research and using balloons, are you building your own balloons now, or still just it's better to buy them off of Alibaba or whatever?
Yeah, so I do not build my own balloons because I know the balloons that I use, right? I know they work, I know they float, I know they stay up a long time, and I know I can get good science out of them. So to maximize my time, I just use balloons that, I've proven have worked if you pressure test them correctly. So my focus has really gone from, doing the launches to myself to instead building tools that can use everyone's data, gets all the data in the same place to be able to be used by, any other researcher who wants to use the balloons for any scientific studies, right? So that's kind of the scope as like a scientist. It's more about basically getting data in one place to kind of, broaden the atmospheric science community, I guess you could say.
Kind of like what HamSci is doing with their remote receivers everywhere.
Yes, exactly.
In your case, you're monitoring balloon transmitters everywhere.
Yes.
Have you created then some kind of a site or some kind of a data gathering?
Yes, exactly. I actually talked about this at the Hamvention out in Dayton. It's called the Pico Balloon Archive, and basically it is a website that is designed to consolidate Pico balloon data from different sources. One is SondHub Amateur, another one is aprs.fi, and then of course just directly from Whisper, the Whisper database. It basically pulls all that data in, does some little quality control, and gets all the data into a kind of a standardized format that people can then download the data, do anything with it, right? So it's all in one place. It's a great research for atmospheric scientists who kind of want to use these Pico balloons to map global circulation patterns.
And it's terrific because other people are paying for the balloons. So all you're getting is the data.
Exactly. Yeah. So I've always been a patron of, stuff that's, open to everybody, kind of this open source kind of community. And when people, it's kind of cool when people do these flights, they can know that, I'm paying to do a fun balloon launch. I get to watch it go around the globe. That's fun. But hey, the data is actually being used, right? And for future publications or for future research. I think that's people kind of like that idea. It's kind of that citizen science kind of side that a lot of people are getting into.
Are there organizations, perhaps in amateur radio, that might fund this research and even help people put together balloons and balloon launches that at the end of the day end up providing data for your database?
Yeah, so right now I can just speak to what I've experienced in my university is right now. We're kind of we'll probably talk about, but the Space Hardware Club here at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, we get money from the Alabama Space Grant Consortium, which basically is under NASA. And we send a proposal as a club, as students, to get money to do student projects. So that's where, I've had my experience for, getting money to actually do the launches, myself. But there are so many grants out there that people, teachers, researchers can apply for to get students involved early in, science and radio, whatever it is in the STEM fields. That's a really hot thing right now. Is people really, these big grant organizations really want to dish out money for people who are trying to get students involved early. It's outreach is probably one of the number one things that is funded all around the country. It's really important.
Outreach for STEM.
Yes. Well, yes, I can speak to STEM because, I'm STEM, 100% STEM boy here. Yeah, the STEM outreach. And one of the big things, we'll probably talk about it is, we did all these big eclipse balloons, where we flew all these balloons under the solar eclipse. That was actually, we got some of our money from directly from NASA. It was the Nationwide Eclipse Ballooning Project, where they were giving money to all these different schools to get students involved in ballooning, to go out and have a trip funded to go to the solar eclipse and fly these payloads and build all these payloads and learn about STEM. So that was a full NASA program that was really dedicated for younger students learning about all these, engineering and science principles. So, hundreds of students participated in that. It was a really big success.
Just as an aside, are the universities having a difficult time enrolling enough students in STEM? Is STEM not a popular subject for people your age these days?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends where you are. Specifically, at University of Alabama in Huntsville, we are a research institution, right? So most of our people here are in some STEM field, right? And when I say STEM, right, that's kind of a massive umbrella, right? I mean, when science, technology, engineering, like that's a huge umbrella. So it includes, especially when you just include scientists and engineers, that's like over probably 30 different majors, right? Under that one umbrella, probably way more than 30. So, my experience, I don't see STEM slowing down at all. I mean, STEM is what keeps our civilization going, to be honest. It's probably, and that's why there's so much interest in this, these people want to fund all these student projects because they know STEM is so important, right? It's what makes the world go round in the end.
We need to continue to have the high priesthood of technology to keep the machines of life going.
Exactly.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a project that you did called the Polar Day Antarctica Radio Propagation using amateur radio beacons, where you actually were launching balloons from Antarctica.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about what that project was and what interesting knowledge came from launching the balloons from Antarctica?
Yeah, so that was a really exciting trip that, I got to go on. I actually submitted a proposal to Niedermeyer Station 3, which is the German Antarctic base. And if that sounds familiar to people, if you do a lot of whisper, you probably know that that's where there's a amateur radio whisper beacon down at Niedermeyer Station 3. So that's why I submitted my proposal there, because they already have a whisper station there, and the balloons, the Pico balloons, operate on whisper. So when I did that, I had, 3 objectives for that study going down there is, first of all, can myself, right, bring, all these balloons, all this resources down in my carry-on luggage and do a scientific experiment in Antarctica? Because as everyone probably knows, Antarctica, a pretty remote place, right? Logistically, it's really hard to get stuff down there. It's hard to do science. It's expensive. You have to pay a lot of money to get your resources down there. So, the proposal I was saying is low-cost science, right? I'm literally showing up with everything I need, except the helium, which they already had down there, to do this experiment. So that's kind of a logistical thing first. Like, is this project, feasible logistically? The second one was just to see if the balloons would survive in Antarctic conditions when you're launching them from the surface. It's so cold, right? Such a different climate down there compared to mid-latitudes. So that was another one. And then there was, tracking them, seeing if they survive, how long can they stay up, how can we get good data for meteorological studies. And the last one you alluded to is looking at propagation in the southern hemisphere, specifically on the 20-meter band, which all these balloons, as everyone probably know, Whisper, it's an amazing resource. There's all these different stations around the globe which are listening for these frequencies, decoding frequencies, uploading all the data online. So it's a fully available tool for everybody to use. So the study itself, the radio propagation study was basically to see when we have these balloons going around Antarctica, how does the propagation change, right? Because I was down there during polar day, which basically means the sun never sets. So you see the sun kind of dip towards the horizon, and then it just goes back up. It never goes below the horizon. And I talk a lot about this in this paper about looking at solar elevation angle as a function of how far, you're being picked up on these balloons. Because remember, these balloons are not stationary. They're going around. They're changing location constantly. So Whereas like a whisper beacon on the ground, it's at that one site. It's just sitting there. So you only really get propagation data from one point. And the Niemeyer Station 3 whisper beacon, it's really the only constant whisper beacon on Antarctica right now. So these balloons were a really great complement during the season as they were flying around. So that's kind of the summary of this study. But I can talk about some of the really interesting results that we got from that paper.
How many balloons were you flying?
There was 6 whisper balloons that successfully stayed up. 1 leaked, and then we flew another experimental tracker, but it had a GPS issue. So I think in total we flew 9. The first one I launched was actually APRS, and I had my little radio. I was just doing VHF, and when I went over the horizon, it was just gone. So I couldn't hear it. It did show up like a month later over the station, which was really cool.
You stayed for a month, or there was an APRS?
It was funny, actually. I was there for a month. I left, came back to the States, and then like the third day I was back at the States, the APRS balloon showed back up over the station. And I actually got a email from my buddy down there who kind of did all the radio communication stuff at the station. And he's like, "It's back. It showed back up on the radio."
If the balloons were going to stay over Antarctica, APRS might have been a better choice on the one hand. On the other hand...
Well, it wouldn't be because, I mean, if you think about it, APRS, right, it's only line of sight. So the balloons can be on the other side of the Antarctic continent, and they're not in line of sight of the station, right? They're not. You get around 330-mile circle around based on where these fly. So literally, when I flew that first APRS balloon, it was only in range for 2 days, and then it was gone. It was over the horizon.
Were the whisper balloons picked up by other 20-meter whisper stations around the world besides?
Oh, my gosh. Yeah. I mean, it's the propagation from these 20-meter whisper balloons was probably, the most just incredible propagation I've seen as far as Pico balloons. Our power output on these trackers is very little. It's, I think, the Sky trackers, they typically transmit at 23 milliwatts. So very low power, and yet we are literally being heard all the way, at high latitudes. I mean, from the South Pole. I mean, literally, I think, when you look at the distance, it's almost the circumference of the whole globe. The signal is literally traveling almost all the way around. I mean, it's just incredible. And what's great is because, like I said, the Whisper network, you have these beacons all over the place. You can see who's picking you up on the map, right? So if I send a transmission, 5 minutes later, I go on whispernet.org and I can see it right then and there. It's live, right? Sometimes these another really cool thing is these AWI, the same people who run the Niemeyer Station 3, they also have an icebreaker that has a whisper station on it that would kind of go around, different places and many, many, many times we were actually hitting that boat, wherever that boat was. So you could actually track where the boat was going based off of, the whisper, when it was decoding it. So it's, absolutely incredible how far we sent these signals. And, in that study, in the paper, I talk a lot about correlating, the solar elevation angle versus how far the signal traveled, right? And, what we found is, if you're below around, 50 degrees, that's when you can really send these signals to incredible distances. And because it's polar day and the sun's pretty low to the horizon, right? We were sending signals like all the way across the globe, like basically for most of the day because the sun was so low.
You're gray lining all day long, right?
Exactly. Gray line. Yep. Gray line propagation. That paper was so incredible is because, these balloons, like I said, they're moving. So we were sending signals from very close to the South Pole. We were sending signals over, all these different ranges of latitudes, which typically never, ever, ever had a whisper transmitter at ever, because, you can't really set up a whisper transmitter anywhere in Antarctica, right? Because you got to have all these logistics. You have to take it out. How are you getting power? How are you doing all this? Well, again, it's Antarctica. It's logistically very difficult to do things. But with the balloons, you launch them and you just sit back, basically, and it does the science for you. It's incredible.
You're measuring propagation on 20 meters. You're measuring elevation and location. Are you measuring anything else, temperature, anything like that?
So the balloons we flew in Antarctica, they measured, this is what they measure. So you get location, so latitude, longitude, the altitude the balloon is at, right? So that's from the GPS. We also sent back solar voltage, so basically how much, the solar panels were receiving. And then, when I say solar elevation angle, all that is, it's basically, we don't measure that, we calculate that. Because there's a Python package you can use that will basically, you give it the latitude, longitude, and the time, and it will give you the solar elevation angle for where your balloon was. We did send back some temperature data, but that's a whole other rabbit hole I can go down about measuring temperature on Pico balloons. It's very difficult, and we're actually building a sensor to do that for future flights. But so those were kind of the things we were measuring in the Antarctica study. The Whisper website is so excellent because when you send a signal and it's received from a station, it will calculate that distance between the sender and the receiver automatically, right? So you can actually, pull all this data from the Whisper website, and it has, where the latitude, longitude of the receiver was. Where was your latitude, longitude? What was the distance between those stations? And there's a lot of other things. The power, the signal to noise ratio, all these values are just automatically in the Whisper, database to be used.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. Whisper is a standard that somebody created in terms of what the packets are, and the ability to put that information into a Whisper packet was somebody added that. In order to add additional sensor data, did Whisper have to be redefined?
No, it actually did. It doesn't, because basically what we're trying to do is, we're sending all these transmissions. Is the first transmission is our larger grid square, and then we typically send another transmission that gets that grid square to a smaller, we call 6-digit grid square, right? And then we're actually sending, we call them telemetry calls, which basically are another string of letters, which actually have the letters, the letters inside that block represent the sensor data.
So because you're using letters, then it gives you a much larger vocabulary.
Exactly.
For defining anything, right? What sensor you're using and what data is coming.
Yes, and what you can actually do, and Whisper is actually great. I think, they picked up really quickly that people were, using Whisper for balloons, is if you actually go on whispernet.org and you go to the map and you go to actually search for call signs, you can choose to exclude or include, they're called special call signs. So you can choose to exclude call signs which typically start with a Q or a 0, because those are typically used for balloon telemetry. Right. So they've actually added that feature where you can say, okay, well, I only want to look at stationary stations, or, I want to include the special telemetry calls.
Now, there was something unusual because in the article that I read, it appeared to me that you were using, perhaps these were sponsors, other hams that lent their call signs to these balloons.
Yeah.
So you were able to get the balloons donated by individual hams so that their call sign would ride on the balloon?
Yes, exactly. So I flew my call sign, of course, on the balloon. We had a kind of a younger student. We flew his call sign, so he was really excited to see his call sign flying over Antarctica. He was really happy about that. We used Bill's call sign. We also flew some. I actually got a tracker sent to me from another Pico balloon group who, I flew down there for them. So they got to see their Pico balloon being launched from Antarctica. So, yeah, I had a lot of great kind of collaboration between different groups and flying different call signs to make, that trip happen and to have all those call signs in the air. So it was more than just me. I got to give credit to all these awesome hams who, wanted to see their call signs fly as well.
And there was something unusual that happened with regard to longitude lines?
Yes. So this is what's really interesting about, Whisper, the Whisper grid system it's called, right? So when you have all these different grids, right, you have a grid for a particular location. The Whisper grids, actually, the size of the grids, right, change with latitude. Because if you think about it, we're on a globe, right? So if you have a grid system, the grids are typically going to get thinner as you get closer to the poles, right? So that has a lot of interesting implications for, let's say I'm trying to calculate, wind speed and direction between 2 points, right? The grid is going to change size. So that calculation that you're doing is also kind of going to change because the sizes of the grid are different, which is really interesting. And in that article, you probably saw that, I had this nice polar map that shows, all the different spots. You can see as you get closer to the South Pole, the dots become much, much smaller because the grids are so much thinner, right? So you can go between different grids compared to if you're at the equator, which the grids are much larger. Right? That was really cool to see. Another interesting thing that I discovered when I was actually down there is if anyone uses APRS.fi, have you used APRS.fi, Eric, at all?
I haven't. No, I'm not an APRS guy. I should be, I guess.
Yeah, probably a lot of listeners will find this interesting because APRS is a really big, factor in the ham community for tracking and, doing all these different cool things. What the balloons, we were porting data to APRS.fi from Whisper, whisper.org. So you could go on APRS and track the balloon. APRS.fi actually was it actually won't let you upload data if you're basically above 88 degrees south. So we found we couldn't upload the data to APRS because it thought it was a bad packet. They're like, there's no way anyone's going to be at the South Pole. Their call sign's not going to be there. So that was interesting. We had to overcome that to make sure we didn't lose any data because that system is not, it throws out data because it thinks it's just somebody putting in, a bad latitude, longitude point, when in reality, our balloons were really there. So that was interesting to find out.
You made a presentation that you alluded to just a few minutes ago last week at the Dayton Hamvention on eclipse ballooning. Briefly, can you say what is eclipse ballooning? And then I'll refer people to your presentation, which will have a link in the show notes page.
Yeah, so eclipse ballooning is, we all know what a solar eclipse is, right? We get this beautiful shadow, across the land. And basically, our goal during that was to fly all these different scientific payloads under the path of totality, right? To kind of do cool science. And when I say science, it can take a lot of different forms. It can be, atmospheric science. It can be kind of more physics, or it can just be observation platforms like cameras, right? Because we all love to see really beautiful photos. I know there was so many photos of the solar eclipse when it happened over North America, but having video from a observer that is much higher up, right, of that shadow coming over the horizon it's an absolutely beautiful thing. So eclipse ballooning, in terms of what we did here at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, is I think I already mentioned this. We were both doing our own separate projects, as well as we were involved in the Nationwide Eclipse Ballooning Project, which is a NASA initiative to kind of get students all around the country involved in STEM projects to build high-altitude balloons and to fly those balloons under the solar eclipse. So for NASA, we had a live stream payload, we had a gravity experiment payload, we had like an atmospheric science payload, and then on the Space Harbor Club side, we built a shadow band payload, which basically looks at different light oscillatory phenomena just before totality happens, to understand the frequency of those light oscillations. And we also flew our own camera payload, so a 360 camera, GoPro camera, as well as Geiger counter payloads, which were actually designed to look at cosmic radiation changes from 4 different balloon payloads when they were under the path of totality. So that was all student-led, all student project. In total, I think 26 or 28 students went out, and it was all done basically student-led. I mean, it's incredible to see, all these students who are taking all these skills they learned either in the classroom or themselves and kind of putting it to work to do an actual project that can yield a lot of really cool data.
One of the things that all us old people that listen to the QSO Today podcast are always thinking is, how do we get young people into the hobby? Now, one of the things that intrigued me about looking at your website was the Space Hardware Club at the University of Huntsville, and that it's not limited to balloons. It looks like it's robotics and all kinds of things where amateur radio can play a part. If you were going to write a marketing campaign to attract young people to amateur radio, how might you make that presentation as a way to hook young people into ham radio?
My experience, where I started was, the only reason why I got into ham radio was to, accomplish some other goal, right? It was to do balloon payload tracking. Ham radio, the kind of the older generation of ham radio, it's, there's a lot of voice, right? What people like to talk on air, right? That's kind of the history of ham radio is kind of, voice communication. I think for younger people who are interested in so many different things, like, building their own Arduino computer or building their own little payload to do some task, I think ham radio needs to be thought of more as a tool to accomplish, a greater objective. Because that's how I got into ham radio, is because, I'm into ballooning. How can I use amateur radio as a tool to enhance my ballooning, right? So another good example is we have a rover project at, University of Alabama, Huntsville, Space Harbor Club. How can we use radio to make our rover better, right? Because it's trying to accomplish a goal that, you might already have a lot of experience in. And like, how can we incorporate ham radio, which, I might not know a lot about, but I know a lot about that rover. How can I pull that in together to make my system work better? So I think that's a better way to try to get younger people involved, because a lot of young people, especially in the STEM field, already have, a lot of cool hobbies, if it's, either STEM related or any other hobby that, ham radio could really help improve their hobby already. So I think that's a great way to try to get the younger people involved in the hobby, because it really is an amazing thing.
So in other words, a way to do it would be to actually go to the hardware clubs, the maker clubs, for example.
Yeah.
Where there are young people trying to accomplish something and saying, hey, we can extend the radio range on this by thousands of miles by using amateur radio, and that might be the hook.
That's right on the point. Another great example is, we have these, all these different competitions actually in the club. The rover is actually a competition. We also have, this other competition club participated in. It's called CanSat, and they actually have to use radio comms between a payload and a ground station. So you can see that, the engineering side and the science side, it's, ham radio is somehow the glue that can hold those together and make it stronger, for sure. So I think that's definitely the key to try to get younger people involved is advertising it as an incredible tool that can enhance, the knowledge you might already have.
Now, obviously, there's some license-free radio bands, like LoRa, for example. Is anybody doing Pico ballooning using LoRa?
I think I heard a little bit about someone using LoRa before, but I haven't really. I've always just been true VHF and Whisper HF balloons. It's just the tools are already set up; they're there, and I don't have a lot of experience in that other regard. But that's a great point you make, because I think a lot of the barriers right now for people getting into ham radio is the license, right? It's they think like, oh, I got to take a test, and you say the word test and young people run for the hills, right? It's like they don't want to study, they want to be doing the cool stuff, they want to be building stuff, right? So that's definitely a really great place for students to start out, is that unlicensed area. There's another great thing that Space Harbor Club used. They're called XBs. I don't know if you heard about them.
Say it again.
It's literally just XBEE. So these are really great because it's unlicensed, and there's you can interface these little XB radios with your microcontroller setup. So you can design a PCB. You can write code to basically configure these little XB radios to send data right to a ground station.
These radios are then like in the ISM band, in the non-licensed 432 or 900 megahertz band.
Exactly. Yep. So that's a really great step for students to kind of, it's low power. It's, it's kind of, there's a lot of tools already out there that, students can work with, packages, coding packages. So that's what we've seen a lot of students kind of get their foot in the door with first, is these little XP radios. And then over time, if, you feel like you want more, then that's that gateway into, getting, something else, maybe getting to APRS or, something that has a little bit more power, and getting your actual, tech license. So that's kind of, the pathway I've seen. But that's a great point you bring up, Eric, is, the unlicensed stuff is kind of the easiest gateway for younger people, because there's not that barrier yet where you have to take a test.
Right, but it's very limited in terms of its range and function.
It is limited, but it's limited, but it's a great way to get those really intro-level principles with coding, engineering, CAD, or whatever, when you're like designing something to do your own little tiny task, right?
Now, the listeners are probably saying, this is really great. Todd is very interesting on the whole balloon thing. Does Todd own a rig? Do you actually have any radios, Todd?
So I have a Kenwood THD-74. That was my first radio. It's a handheld. I love that radio because of its APRS functionality. It actually decodes all APRS packets. And it has built-in GPS. So, when I was out in the field trying to recover these balloons, sometimes the backup GPS tracker would fail. And I would it'd be like a fox hunt. I'd have to go out with my Kenwood and track down these balloons from the APRS packet. I was actually just at Dayton. I actually just got the new THD-75. I was very happy about that. I've been waiting for that radio for a lot. So that's my primary radio. I also do some D-Star on there. That's kind of interesting. Been trying to get more into D-Star. That's a great radio to do D-Star on.
So you are talking to people.
Oh yeah. So I'm on. I'm definitely on the air sometimes when I find the time as a PhD student.
Does Huntsville have an amateur radio club on campus?
Under the Space Harbor Club, there actually is a amateur radio section of the club. So we've actually done in the past licensing for students. So actually teaching classes to get students licensed. We actually had some people not even in the club come and take the tech and general license under the Space Harbor Club, which is really cool. So yeah, we do have a Space Harbor Club ham radio. I think we're trying to grow it a little more.
Do you have a repeater on campus?
No, we don't have a repeater on campus, but that sounds like a really good idea. Yeah,
I'll connect it to All-Star or D-Star or something like that.
Yeah. What's really nice about Huntsville, though, is, we have, there's Huntsville, and then we have Monte Sano, which is this big mountain, and there's some good repeaters actually on the mountain. So if you're in Huntsville, you can actually, that's how I connect to the D-Star repeater is literally I just walk outside because the mountain's right there. It's right up there.
If you were going to give advice to new or returning hams who might have an interest after listening to this episode in, getting into Pico ballooning, and maybe they don't want to start where you started on YouTube, where would you send them? What advice would you give them?
The one thing, specifically Pico ballooning, is Bill Brown is an excellent resource because, when you talk to him about Pico ballooning, he will tell you everything about the hobby. And if you were to get one of his sky trackers, what's so excellent about that is it shows up in the box, everything configured, which is really great for someone who might not be into soldering or doesn't really have a background in that. And being able to just do a flight like that already configured is kind of what hooks you to then want to learn more, right? I think sometimes what's really hard with these like kind of STEM hobbies is some people, if they're new, some people try to like load too much onto them and they get exhausted too quick. And then they kind of like don't want to do it anymore. Bill's great because when he sends you a tracker and, he's there with you, he's talking to you on the phone about it, and it kind of gets you more interested because you feel like you can participate more, even if you don't really have a background in that. That's what I recommend. Bill Brown's the man for, getting into the Pico balloon hobby. I'm flying one of his sky trackers. That's kind of what got me into it, and I'm still hooked. So I think I can say that worked.
If you were trying to find a ballooning community, a Pico ballooning community, so that you could see if there's anybody even locally in your state or in your town, so you're not soloing on Pico ballooning, can you recommend any websites?
Definitely. It's amateur. When I say amateur hobby, right, there are so many forums out there, balloon forums, and I think there's a really good forum that, there's a lot of people talking about Pico balloons on the forum. I need to go back and find the link. I could probably email it to you after the meeting, where basically people are just talking about this hobby, right? And what's great about, this intersection between balloons and amateur radio, if you see a balloon, let's say on SonTub, amateur, right, they have their call sign. You can look up their call sign and you can talk to them and you can ask them what they're doing. It's not like it's just some random person online who just has a username. People who are doing ham radio balloons, they all have their FCC call sign. They're all, on the database. You can reach out to these people.
Right, you can look them up on QRZ.
Yeah, exactly. You can look these people up and know what they're doing, and you can reach out to them and talk to them. And I think that's what's so great is, I think this is one of the hobbies, amateur radio is the one hobby that is really excellent at just linking people together. I mean, obviously, right, it's all about making contacts. So ballooning in ham radio, it's the same exact thing, right? So if you're trying to get into ballooning, there's already all these tools out there that can link you with people who are doing the ballooning already. So that's what I recommend. And that's how I got into it. I went on SonTub and I saw a flight happening and I was like, how is that person doing that? How is that balloon staying up there that long? Like, that's crazy. And I just looked up the call sign and boom, that's how I got into the hobby is, that connection.
Todd, this has really been amazing for me. I think I've learned more about ballooning in this hour than I have in the past. I'm anxious now that I've got 2 QRP Labs Whisper transmitters coming to launch my own balloons, and hopefully I'll find some people here. I want to thank you so much for joining me on QSO today. I wish you 73 and hope to run into you live in person someplace, maybe at Huntsville or Dayton next year.
Of course, yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on, Eric. It was great to talk. And it's great to reminisce on the journey I had, and I hope people have been a little interested about ham radio and balloons. Yeah.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Todd. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KN4TPG in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.